I'm Wendy Garf-Lipp from United Neighbors, and this is Connections. Today I have two guests with me. Both are from the South Shore Resource and Advocacy Center. I'd like to introduce you to Bill McCoy. Bill is the Director of Homicide Bereavement, and Amy Silva, who is the Amy Sylvia, excuse me, the program coordinator for the Road to Healing program. So I want to start with you, Bill. Tell me, what is a director of homicide bereavement?
Well, I, with my coworker, Karen Fabrizio, will meet with survivors of homicide victims. We go to people's homes. We go to court with them. I was in court this morning in Brockton Superior Court to offer support. We run a group every other Thursday night in Brockton. We primarily just listen to folks and try to guide them through a traumatic experience. It doesn't ever end, really, but we're there to provide moral support.
I understand you use an acronym, SHARES?
SHARES stands for Surviving Homicide's Aftermath, Resources, Education, and Support.
Mm-hmm. So what makes surviving a homicide different than a normal death in your family?
Well, I always think of a man who was traumatized by Hurricane Katrina. He said that after you've experienced that kind of trauma, everything in your life is measured from that point. So people who are survivors of homicide victims, their world is turned upside down and there's no such thing as closure, but they tend to measure everything from that moment on. Sometimes it gets terribly depressing, which is true for grief in general. Other times it seems like life is out of control, which is different. When the police come knocking at your door and give you that horrible news, life is out of control. So anything a survivor can do to help gain back some control is helpful. But it's a control issue, I think, more than anything else. But there's also a search for meaning when something like this happens, especially when somebody feels their son or daughter or husband, wife, was living a good life. Why should this happen? So there is no good answer for that, and as opposed to when someone dies from cancer, well, it's a disease that oftentimes can kill. So it's different in regards to finding meaning and also trying to gain control of something that initially hits you with like anymore.
So Kubler-Ross talks about the stages of grief. Does a homicide bereavement person go through the same stages? Are they different?
Yes,
I
I attended a workshop or a training recently called the 6th Stage of Grief, which was trying to find meaning. There are the normal stages of grief, from numbness to anger to depression to trying to negotiate. All those are real for survivors of homicide victims. But they come and go, and Kubler-Ross never meant for them to be understood sequentially. Right. You can be feeling guilty for a time, and then you don't walk away from that. That might recur 6 months or 2 years down the road. And the same is true for survivors of homicide victims. These stages tend to come and go. You can feel like, gee, I'm 3 years out from this terrible event, but why am I feeling as if it just happened?
And I imagine that if you're dealing with grief, God forbid somebody dies who's older in your family, someone who has cancer, is very different than the immediacy of losing someone unexpected in a way that is so different from what our world is.
Well, I've heard many people say, this is not how it's supposed to be. I'm supposed to predecease my offspring. I'm not, I shouldn't be having to deal with my daughter or son dying before me.
And how does someone cope with that loss? Is there
as many
anything?
ways to cope as there are people who are survivors of homicide victims. Some people find going back to work helpful, the routine. Some people can't bear to go back to work. Some people, woman I was talking with yesterday, could not go back to her job working with youth because her son was murdered in New Bedford. So she is looking for something different. She finds going to mediums helpful. People who are in churches or synagogues or mosques find their faith is what sustains them. So there are different ways. Again, it's a matter of control. What helps me gain some control of my life. It could be exercise, it could be gardening, whatever seems to provide some sort of outlet for all the energy that the trauma builds up.
What do you say when someone is unconsolable? I mean, I know I always have difficulty engaging with someone who's had a loss. I have some pat things that I say, under better circumstances. We hope you'll find strength. But it feels very platitude-y.
Yeah, and there are things you don't want to say. For instance, I meet with a woman in Fall River who survived the station nightclub fire, and 3 months after that, her husband said to her, "You should be over this by now." Well, you certainly don't say that, because you never get over that.
Snap out of it.
Snap out of it, yeah. The most important thing is listening. Sometimes silence is the best. If people are open to an embrace helps. It depends on the individual, but primarily I made the mistake not long ago of talking with somebody who was in the thick of the marathon bombing, and I started to speak to him about his integrity and what a fine person. He didn't want to hear that. He just needed to vent, and I should have listened to him and kept silent.
Right. Sometimes these things come in waves, and we revisit. We think we're over something, and then it comes back to us, and then we have to revisit again. So we're going to talk a little bit in a minute about how people can connect with you and what kind of services you provide. But let's turn to Amy for a second and talk a little bit about the Road to Healing program. What does that do?
So the Road to Healing program works with individuals who've been affected in some way by an impaired driving crash. In this case, we work with substance-impaired drivers. There are obviously lots of ways to be impaired while you're driving, but we work specifically with substance-impaired drivers. And the person affected could be someone who's been in a crash and survived. It could be like someone who has lost somebody to a crash, or it could even be a witness to a crash. Often that can be a traumatic event. And like with some of the folks that Bill deals with, it's the sudden nature, if there's a fatality, of the loss, the fact that it is somebody's fault, that there's a place to lay the blame, that it was preventable in the case of impaired driving. So we work with those people to provide them with support and advocacy services. Again, similar to what Bill does, just a different criteria for the clientele, really. We go to court with them, we provide someone to listen to. For survivors, it's very often trying to discover what their new normal is. They may be severely injured after the crash. Their life may never go back to the way it was before. So they're struggling with that. I wanted to do this with my life, or I was doing this with my life, now I can no longer do that. How do I move forward with that?
Bill mentioned before that you look at your life from before this incident and then after this incident.
Absolutely
right,
true.
so that must be a tremendous change it must shift everything in the way you relate to people, the way you relate to your family, the way you relate to the environment. So what are some of the things that you can do to help with the trauma of someone who has been a victim of an impaired driving?
Again, like Bill said, it can vary from person to person what you do. Some of the survivors I've worked with, and some of the people who have lost family members, have chosen to speak out and share their stories. And they find value and meaning in that. Whether it's educating somebody on their experience or sharing the pain of their loss, keeping their loved one's memory alive, all of those things. So sometimes people find meaning in doing things like that. And sometimes it's just finding new ways to cope with what they're going through. Trauma affects people differently. So it depends on the coping strategies and skills they have already, what their past experiences are like, what their social support is like, what the community response to a crash is like. So it all depends on, how they cope depends on those things.
I was, you gave me some statistics that I'd like to share. So these are from 2018. It always takes a couple of years before we can get the real statistics. So this is the newest ones we have. So 10,511 people were killed in alcohol-impaired crashes in the United States. In 2018 in Massachusetts, there were 120 fatal alcohol-impaired crashes. 50 to 75% of convicted drunk drivers continue to drive with a suspended license. This was shocking to me
Blows your
to
mind.
hear. That you think that someone has their license taken away, that means they're not going to drive anymore, but obviously that's not the case.
That's not the case.
Most children who die in alcohol-related crashes were riding with the impaired driver. So not only are drivers impaired, but they're putting children in the car with them and taking those children's lives. And on average, this one blew me away. On average, a driver will drive impaired over 80 times before the first arrest. This is shocking.
Those are shocking statistics. The 50 to 75% continuing to drive with their suspended license almost always gets people's attention. And that's because you think somebody, your license is taken away, you're not going to drive. But these people are just like everybody else. They've got to go to work, they've got to take their mom to the doctor, they've got to take their kid to soccer practice, and they take the risk. A far better solution, and one that we're working on, and Mothers Against Drunk Driving in particular is advocating for, is what's called an interlock device, which is installed in the car, and the driver has to blow into it before the car will start. So if their blood alcohol is over a certain limit, the car won't start.
So there's always a flip side to something. What's the flip side to this? It seems to me every car should have one.
Right. Well, actually, that is coming. I think in probably 10, 15 years, we're all going to have, if we buy a new car, there's a system called DADS. I don't know what the acronym stands for, but it is a system that's going to basically be in everyone's car that's going to detect blood alcohol for all of us. So it'll be just like your airbag or your seatbelt or what is now. This will be another safety device. These interlock devices in Massachusetts, if you're convicted a second time of a DUI or OUI, as we say in Massachusetts, the judge can order you to have one of these installed. MAD would like to see it first-time offenders. Right now, we can't do that legally. We can't have a first-time offender put one of these in the car. So most states are now doing that, where it's a first-time offender penalty, I guess you want to call it. But that way someone could continue to live their life and drive safely with the rest of us,
Right. Right. Tell me about some things you brought here.
I did bring some things.
Show and tell.
So part of our grant is the direct victim services that we've talked about. And by the way, both for Bill's program and my program, those are free, completely free.
Okay, so all your services,
Completely
homicide, bereavement, and driving?
Grant funded.
Grant funded.
Okay, and while we're on this moment, how do we find you? If someone wants to connect with you, how do they do that?
They can call our center, which is South Shore Resource and Advocacy Center, and the phone is 508-746-2664.
508-726-746 2664. Okay, we'll try and get that on the bottom of the screen. Okay, and that's for both your programs.
That's for both of our programs. They can find, Bill and I are often on the road visiting clients or doing things, but they can get to us. They have our number, so they'll find us. So part of it is direct victim services, and like I said, that's all free. And then we also have, for the Road to Healing, a prevention and education component. It's a second grant. And we do prevention and education in the community, in the schools, around impaired driving. So I did bring a couple of things just to show. One of our programs that's going to be kicking off soon is an I Promise campaign, which is a prom time campaign, which we work with prom dress stores, tuxedo rental stores, salons, schools to hand these out at prom time. The stores actually put the flyer on the dress or the tuxedo as it's going out the door. And basically it's a pledge that students and their parents fill out to say, I have a plan for getting home safely, and I promise that if that doesn't work out, I will call you.
Yeah, so let's see what it says here.
Yeah.
It says 54% of teens drink 4 or more drinks on prom night. 36% of teens said their parents allowed them to attend a party where there would be alcohol. 14% of teens said parents provide them with alcohol on prom night, and over 40% of all 10th graders have drank alcohol. So this is very cool. It's a little pledge. The student says, I, put their name, promise to have a plan for the evening, and if anything falls through, to call my parent or guardian for help, and they sign it. And then the parent promises that if you need a ride for any reason, I will come get you with no questions asked. I just want you home safe. We would never want a child to be in fear of calling his parents when he needed a lift or she needed a lift, because of the repercussions that might happen.
Absolutely.
And we need parents to understand that too. Your children have to feel comfortable in picking up the phone and saying, I need a lift home.
You can have a further discussion with your child the next day
Right.
about
It's
the
not
behavior
without, right. It's not
and the
without
consequences.
But in that
Right.
moment,
In that moment, you want to make sure, and if for any reason a student is not comfortable with their parent, maybe it's an older sister or your aunt or your grandmother or whoever it is, but have a safe person to call that you've discussed this with. So that's one of our projects that we do in the prevention and education section. We also, like I said, go to schools, and this is one of the tools we utilize when we go to schools. These are called fatal vision goggles. They simulate alcohol impairment. So you can try it. The student puts them on, and then we have a variety of tasks that require balance and coordination so that they can get the feel of being impaired without actually being impaired.
Put it down, let me see if I can pick it up. Okay.
So we have them do tasks like walking a straight line or picking something up. And they're at various levels of alcohol impairment.
Okay, so I see the bottle here,
Yeah.
here, and here.
So the ones you have on are actually the sort of the highest level of impairment. So I brought the really, strong
Right, but
ones.
it's good to see that.
But
right.
it's good to see that. And what the point is of these is they show you what it feels like to be impaired while your judgment is still intact. So if you'd had that much to drink, your judgment would be gone. And you might think, I'm okay, I can do this.
Right.
I'm only going 5 miles down the road. Well, no, you're not okay.
Aren't most accidents within?
That's what they say. A lot
yeah.
of accidents happen close to home.
Right. You don't have to be traveling on the highway for an accident to happen.
You absolutely
right.
don't have to be on the highway.
Right.
So we use those to illustrate the impairment. So we do that in schools. We take them to health fairs, family fun nights, all kinds of different venues for people to test out and see. And the goal is to get them to understand impairment without actually being impaired.
Bill, I want to turn back to you for a minute. We talk about secondary trauma. What does that mean?
Secondary trauma is when you are immersed in someone's life who's been traumatized. It sometimes rubs off on you. For example, some years ago I was at a murder trial in Suffolk Superior Court, and man I was with, his daughter was murdered and her throat was slit. And the two defendants who were there, who actually did this, were kind of scary guys. And I found out after that I had some secondary trauma when my wife would walk across the kitchen going to chop some vegetables with a knife in her hand. I found myself beginning to get very nervous. That's an example. Karen, who I work with, spoke about a recent homicide, suicide, where some children were killed by the father before he killed himself, and that took her back to a time in her life when she lost a cousin in similar circumstances. So when she was helping this family, she found herself in need of help herself by speaking with someone to kind of debrief. So that would be two examples of secondary trauma.
So if people wanted to come talk to you, do they have to come to Plymouth to meet you?
No, they don't. They can call the number we gave at South Shore Resource and Advocacy Center, and then we go to them. We go to their homes, coffee shops, wherever they feel comfortable talking. We try to make it as comfortable for them as possible. And sometimes we'll meet with them once or twice. Sometimes it'll go on for a long, long time. But they do not have to come to us. Sometimes it's a phone call. I meet with a guy who actually has an interesting past, a young man who will simply text me and say, "Sup?" and I'll sup him back. And before long, we're talking a little bit about what might be on his mind, but sometimes he just needs to know that I'm out there and I'm going to respond to him.
Talk to me, how many people do you deal with in a year? I mean, how much homicide is there in our community?
Well, it's a good question because not everybody takes advantage of this
Obviously,
free and confidential program, but we have about 100 people who are active on our list now. Now that goes back a few years. We have probably 200 people who are inactive. We might meet with them once, we meet with them a couple times. They might come off the inactive list and go on the active list.
And they might be getting support somewhere else.
Exactly
they might,
right.
Yeah, right.
Exactly right.
So, right.
And it may be simply a call. There's a woman in Florida, well, she's in Texas now, but occasionally I'll get a call from her. But she's on the active list because we're in touch.
It's wonderful to know that people can reach out, that they can get the support that they need. Tell me about drunk driving issues. How much do we have in our community?
We have quite a bit. Drinking and driving, Bill and I were talking on our way in, has actually in the last 30 years gone way down, which is great.
Good
and
thing.
that is due to work by law enforcement, work by organizations like MAD, people bringing, shining a light on the issue. And so that's the good news. You read in the facts that still over 10,500 people were killed in 2018. That's a whole lot of people, and that does not include all the people who were injured.
Right.
So
And secondary trauma,
and secondary
family
trauma,
members, right.
Right. I mean, and for every one driving crash or homicide, it's a ripple effect. It's not just that person that's affected.
Correct.
It is, a vast number of people.
Including first responders.
Yes, including first responders who aren't always the best at seeking help, but
see much more than all of us.
yes,
Right.
much more.
On a regular basis.
Absolutely. But we had a recent crash in Pembroke in the end of December, and very tragically, a 13-year-old girl was killed, and her friend, also 13, is still fighting in the hospital. And her, the child who was killed, her mom was injured as well. But there was a whole school of 13, 12-year-olds that were affected by this. That's something these people are never going to forget.
Right.
We all seem to have that kind of story in our past where we remember something happening, in particular if it happens at a young age like that, they're going to remember that. But the community has really come and encircled these people with so much love and support that that's been a positive outcome or ripple effect. But you start to think about the siblings, the aunts, the uncles, the grandparents, the the friends, all the people that are affected by something like that. The same goes with a homicide. It ripples out. And you don't always, I was talking with a client recently, she says, people just don't realize the consequences. This woman lost her daughter. She has a grandchild that she does not see as often as she likes. She very rarely gets to see him because he was given to the other, to the father's side of the family to raise. And, that still, pains her to this day that she doesn't get to spend time with her grandson. So all the other things on top of just the immediate fatality and grief and loss, there is a ripple effect of other things.
I think that culturally it's great to see that we've moved to a place where people can seek the help that they need and talk openly about the grief. When I was in high school many, many years ago in the 60s, I had a classmate who picked up a hitchhiker and was murdered.
Oh gosh.
And I remember coming to school the next day and they announced it on the PA. They didn't give us the details, but they said, so-and-so has passed away. And they said, and it would be good if people didn't talk about it. So looking where we are 50 years down the pike, we realize that burying it and not talking about it is certainly not the right thing to do.
And I probably should have said when you asked how people cope that talking about it can be extremely helpful. It's not for everybody. And especially for men. Men are less apt to talk about it. They're apt to do more physical things to help work through that energy. But I'm a chaplain with the Brockton Fire Department. Firefighters are notorious for not talking about what they go through. But
Daughter
when they
of a firefighter,
do,
I hear you, exactly.
They find that there's a kind of a relief in that. And that's talking with somebody you can trust who's not going to be judgmental and it's going to keep things in confidence is extremely important.
And I love the fact that you're not the school system, you're not the government system, that you're unbiased and that you'll also come to people and connect with people and talk to them. So what happens if there's a whole family that's affected? How do you guys handle that?
Well, recent incident not too far from here includes 4 children. My coworker Karen is meeting with them, includes the mother of those 4 children and the parents of the man who was killed. Going to an arraignment tomorrow. Unlikely that the father of the murder victim will attend, but the mother certainly will. And I wanted to say a word about her. Gentle, lovely person who now for the first time feels rage and hatred, and she's never experienced that before.
Right.
And it's important for me, and I'm sure it is for Amy, to validate that.
Right.
And it doesn't make you an awful person because you feel that way. You have every reason to feel that way. It's what you do with that.
Right. I'm sometimes like the shooting at Mother Emanuel Church. Within days, the survivors were offering, we're fine, we forgive you, forgiveness. That's really hard. I can't offer that kind of forgiveness on something that wasn't even that serious. So how does someone get to that point? I mean, how much work is involved in getting to a point where you can live peacefully, or do you never live peacefully?
I don't think forgiveness is necessary.
Okay, that's a good thing to
I
start
think
with.
that for some people, that's going to be something they need and want to do, and that's great. Like you, I'm not sure I could get there myself.
Right.
But some people are never going to forgive, and I think that's okay. What's counterproductive is if, their lives are sort of consumed by anger and rage. That becomes more difficult. But you don't want to belittle their feelings. Their feelings are their feelings. If they're angry, then okay, they're angry. But I don't think everyone has to forgive. Not
everyone can. And I met with a woman one time who, for her, to put it in religious terms, it would be a sin for her to forgive her son's killer because that would make his life less sacred somehow. And that's how she feels. But I've met with survivors of homicide victims all in Boston and one place or another who work at it. And it's more of a letting go and not letting that incident control you.
Very difficult subject, wonderful conversation. If you need the support, it's out there. South Shore Resource and Advocacy Center. They are willing to help you, your family, and anybody else that's been affected this way. My name is Wendy Garflip from United Neighbors, and this is Connections. Thank you.